Exiled to the edge of the universe, Sira stumbled across the cracked and endless sands of Centaur, a desolate planet forgotten by the stars. The blistering winds whipped around her small, fragile form, causing her pale lavender skin to shimmer in the intense heat. Her 4-foot frame was dwarfed by the towering dunes, the shadows of which seemed to reach out and crush any remnants of hope she still clung to. Once, she had been the shining jewel of the Zephyr, a race of elegant and powerful beings who thrived under the rule of King Erythor. But now, her existence felt like nothing more than a cruel mockery. As she trudged through the unforgiving desert, the memory of her exile burned fresh in her mind. The booming voice of King Erythor echoed in her ears, his words cutting deeper than the heat of the sun itself. "You are a failed vessel, Sira," he had declared, his cold eyes gazing down upon her. "You have no purpose here. You cannot bear heirs. You are useless to me and to the Zephyr." The weight of those words had shattered her. It had only taken seconds for her world to fall apart. Once she had served by Erythor's side, loved and revered by her people for her wisdom and beauty. Now she was cast out, unwanted, discarded. The sandstorms whipped around her, leaving her clothes torn and her body bruised from the harsh terrain. Each step felt like it could be her last, but something deep inside urged her to keep moving, to survive. The wind howled as she collapsed onto the hot sands, her vision fading as exhaustion took its toll. Her heart ached, not from the physical strain, but from the bitter rejection that had broken her spirit. She had been taught to believe that strength and purpose were everything. Now, she had neither. Suddenly, her eyes caught something in the distance, a faint glimmer of light, flickering against the horizon like a beacon of hope. It was unnatural, out of place in the midst of the barren wasteland. A human settlement, perhaps. Sira didn't know what to expect, but survival instincts kicked in. She could either face certain death out here in the desert or take a chance on the unknown. Drawing in a shaky breath, Sira pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the waves of dizziness that threatened to pull her back to the unforgiving sands. She stumbled forward, her legs shaky, her body weak, but her willpower stronger than ever. Every step was a battle, each one an act of defiance against the abandonment she had suffered. The closer she got to the light, the more her hope began to rise. But as she neared the source, her strength faltered, her vision blurred, and she collapsed once more, the sand beneath her like a cold, unforgiving bed. The spark of humanity. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting long shadows across the ragged terrain. Drake, a weathered engineer with the United Earth Exploration Corps, wiped the sweat from his brow as he worked on the malfunctioning generator. The desolate planet, Centaur, had proven to be far more hostile than anticipated. The equipment was deteriorating. The sandstorms were relentless, and morale among the crew was low. Yet, Drake had seen worse. Years spent in the Corbex mining fields had taught him resilience, patience, and the value of grit in the face of adversity. But even he was beginning to feel the pressure of this assignment. "This thing's a pile of junk," he muttered to himself, tightening the bolt on the generator as it let out a strained groan. The equipment had been pushed to its limits by the harsh environment. As he worked, he heard footsteps behind him, the sound of boots crunching on the dry sand. "Drake, you might want to see this," called Lyra, the camp's junior medic. Her voice was filled with urgency, but there was an underlying hesitation too. She was always the pragmatic one, cautious by nature, but this time, something about her tone made him pause. "See what?" he asked, his brow furrowing in concern. Without answering, Lyra gestured for him to follow, leading him toward the perimeter of the camp. As they neared the gathering of their crew, a chill ran down Drake's spine. There, lying in the dust, was a small, fragile figure. Her lavender skin glowed faintly under the harsh light of their camp's generators. She was barely conscious, her body battered and bruised, as though she had been wandering for days. A soft gasp rose from the group as they gathered around her, unsure of how to react. Some of the crew members were already whispering about leaving her. After all, She was one of the Zephyr, a species not known for their friendliness toward humans. She doesn't look hostile, one of the crew muttered, his voice laced with suspicion. But Drake wasn't like the others. He knelt beside her, brushing the sand from her face, his heart pounding as he saw the delicate, almost fragile features of the alien woman. She's not a threat, Drake muttered to himself, more out of reassurance than anything else. Her pale skin, the shimmering violet eyes, and the unmistakable signs of exhaustion only deepened his resolve. He could feel the tension in the air. It was a decision that would affect the camp, and his crew was already on edge. The Zephyr were not known for their warmth toward outsiders, especially humans. Yet, as he looked at the small figure lying on the ground, he couldn't turn away. "She needs help," Drake said firmly. His voice was steady, but his words carried an urgency that couldn't be ignored. "We don't leave people behind." Lyra, standing just behind him, shot him a glance. "You really want to risk this, Drake? The Zephyr could send hunters after us if they know we've taken her in. We've already got enough problems without adding another one." But Drake's mind was already made up. He reached out and gently lifted her into his arms, her tiny frame almost weightless. "We do what's right. If she's human, she deserves help. If she's alien, then she still deserves it." Without waiting for a response, Drake carried the unconscious Zephyr woman toward the medical tent. His mind was racing. What was she doing here? Why had she been left to die alone on this planet? But the questions would have to wait. For now, she needed a safe place to recover, a fragile new beginning. The medical tent hummed with the soft whir of machinery, the air heavy with the sterile scent of antiseptics. Drake carefully laid the fragile Zephyr woman on one of the cot beds, her body limp, barely responsive to the movements. Lyra moved swiftly to the nearby table, grabbing the medical supplies. The camp's resources were limited, but there was enough to stabilize her for now. "She's not human," Lyra murmured, her fingers quickly checking the alien woman's pulse. "Her physiology is unlike anything we've encountered. Her blood pressure is dangerously low, and her body temperature's dropping fast. She's severely dehydrated. Whoever she is, whatever she's from, she's been through hell." Drake watched with quiet concern as Lyra worked, her skilled hands moving with precision. The crew had dealt with injuries and illnesses before, but this was different. This wasn't just some typical rescue mission. This was an alien, a being from a far-off world who had been abandoned, left to perish on a barren planet. The weight of it pressed heavily on Drake's chest. He had seen hardship, but this felt different. There was something inherently wrong about the way she had been treated, something that stirred a deep sense of injustice within him. As Lyra continued her work, Drake couldn't help but wonder what kind of world this woman came from. What kind of society had cast her aside, as though she were nothing more than a broken tool? And what had happened to make her so alone? The questions gnawed at him, and for the first time, he felt like he was staring into something far greater than the harsh reality of the planet they were stuck on. The alien woman's violet eyes fluttered open, blinking against the bright lights of the med tent. Her gaze was unfocused, lost. She blinked again, and then her eyes met Drake's. A surge of recognition flashed in them, though it was brief, like the faintest spark before it vanished entirely. "You're awake," Drake said softly, trying to keep his voice calm. "You're safe now." Syrah's lips parted, but the words didn't come. Her breath was shallow, her body too weak to move. Her head throbbed with the pain of the crash, of the sandstorms, of the weight of rejection and loneliness. She wanted to speak, to ask him why he had helped her, but the strength to form words escaped her. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice raw and weak. Drake could hear the faint tremor in her voice, and it made his heart ache. He had expected her to lash out, to be fearful of humans. He had heard all the stories of the Zephyr, a proud and ancient race who viewed humanity as insignificant beneath their notice. But there was none of that in her eyes. There was only confusion, exhaustion, and something deeper, a silent plea for help. "I'm Drake," he replied, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "We found you out there, in the desert. You were barely alive. My team. Well, we couldn't just leave you." Syrah's mind swirled with questions. Humans, these strange creatures, were the ones who had saved her. But why? Why had they chosen to risk their lives for her, a broken and unwanted exile? She had been cast aside by her own people, deemed unworthy of life, because she could not fulfill the one role that defined her people's worth: bearing children. To be stripped of her title, her purpose, and her dignity had been a cruel fate. Now she found herself in the care of these humans, who did not seem to judge her, but instead showed her nothing but concern. "Why? Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Drake hesitated. He didn't know the full answer himself. Maybe it was because he believed in something greater than just survival. Maybe it was because he could not ignore the suffering of another being, even one so different from himself. Or maybe it was because he knew what it was like to be broken and discarded, to have everything ripped away from you in an instant. "Because everyone deserves help," he said simply, his voice steady. "No one should be left to die, no matter who they are." For a moment, there was silence between them, as Syrah's weary eyes searched his face, trying to comprehend the strange kindness in his words. But as she looked into his eyes, something began to stir within her, a faint glimmer of hope, something she thought she had lost forever. Could it be that these humans were not like the Zephyr? Could they be different? Her mind reeled with possibilities, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to believe that there might be more to this life than the exile she had endured. Syrah struggled to sit up, her body weak, but her determination pushing her forward. She winced as pain shot through her, but she didn't stop. She needed to know more, to understand what had happened to her, and what these humans intended. "I don't know what you want from me," she said, her voice firmer now, though still shaky. "But I cannot stay here. My people, they will come for me. They will punish you for helping me." Drake shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not afraid of your people," he said with quiet conviction. "We help those in need. No one should suffer, no matter what species they are. If you're in danger, we'll protect you. That's what we do here." Syrah looked at him, her violet eyes wide with disbelief. Could it be possible? Could these humans truly care for her without expecting something in return? For the first time, a small seed of trust began to grow in her chest. She couldn't yet fully trust them. Her heart had been shattered too many times. But she had no choice but to trust them for now. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but filled with something new. Gratitude, a faint flicker of hope. Drake nodded, a soft smile pulling at his lips. "You're welcome. Rest now. We'll figure out the next steps soon enough." And as Syrah closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to rest, she couldn't help but wonder if, just maybe, this was the beginning of something greater than the loneliness she had endured for so long. The choice that awaits. Days passed, each one blending into the next in a haze of recovery and quiet reflection. Syrah spent her time in the med tent, her body slowly regaining strength under Lyra's watchful care. The humans were kind to her, but she could sense the unease in their eyes, their uncertainty. They treated her as if she were a fragile thing, a broken vessel, not yet worthy of their trust. But it was their kindness that confused her the most. Her own people had cast her aside without a second thought, deeming her useless, disposable. Here, in this small human camp, she was treated with something she hadn't experienced in so long: compassion. Drake was there every day, checking on her progress, bringing food and water. He never asked questions, never pressed her for answers. He simply offered help, always patient, always steadfast. It was a kindness that left her feeling more vulnerable than she had ever been. And though she didn't want to admit it, she found herself drawn to him. Not in the way of the Zephyr's expectations of love or duty, but in a way that made her wonder if humans could truly be different from the cold, calculating race she had been born into. Yet, despite the warmth of the camp, Sira could not shake the shadow of fear that loomed over her. The Zephyr were not a race to be trifled with. They were proud, ancient, and ruthless when it came to betrayal. Sira's exile was no small thing. The punishment for abandoning a royal heir was severe, and there would be consequences. Grave ones. She could not stay here forever. She could not risk drawing the attention of the Zephyr hunters who patrolled the outer rim of the galaxy, watching for outcasts like her. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the barren desert, Sira sat outside the med tent, her legs tucked underneath her. The cool evening air was a stark contrast to the blistering heat of the day. She stared out at the endless stretch of sand, her mind consumed with thoughts of what lay ahead. Drake joined her, sitting down beside her without a word. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The quiet was comfortable, a space where Sira could breathe, think. Finally, it was Drake who broke the silence. "Thinking about leaving?" he asked, his voice gentle but knowing. Sira turned to him, her violet eyes locking onto his green ones. There was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding. He didn't push her. He didn't pressure her for answers. He simply accepted her for who she was, something she had never known before. "I have to go," Sira replied, her voice soft but resolute. "I can't stay here forever. My people will come. They will punish you for helping me. I can't allow that." Drake's expression softened, and for the first time, Sira saw something flicker in his eyes. Concern, maybe even fear. Not for himself, but for her. "We'll figure it out," he said firmly. "If you want to stay, we'll protect you. You don't have to run." Sira shook her head, her thoughts swirling in confusion. "You don't understand. The Zephyr don't forgive weakness. They don't tolerate failure. I can't return to them. And I can't stay here. You don't know what they'll do if they find me. What they'll do to you." "Then don't go back," Drake said, his voice steady. "Stay with us. We'll help you. We'll figure out a way to keep you safe." His words were simple, but there was a weight to them, a promise, unspoken but understood. Sira could feel it, deep in her chest. The idea of staying, of letting go of the fear that had clung to her for so long, was terrifying. But for the first time since her exile, she felt a small flicker of something else. Hope. "I don't know if I can trust you," Sira admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore." Drake's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a warmth that seemed to cut through the coldness she had carried for so long. "I know you're scared, but you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself. Not anymore." The words settled into Sira's heart, a small seed of trust slowly beginning to take root. She had always been taught that survival was a solitary journey, that weakness was something to be eradicated. But here, with these humans, these strangers, she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was strength in relying on others. "I don't know what my future holds," Sira said softly, her voice quiet, but steady. "But for the first time, I want to find out." Drake smiled, his hand still resting on her shoulder, his grip gentle but reassuring. "Then let's figure it out together." As the night fell, the stars above them blinked to life, distant and cold. But for the first time since her exile, Sira felt like she wasn't alone in the vast, unforgiving universe. The path ahead was unclear, the dangers still looming, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so afraid. The storm on the horizon. The days following Sira's decision to stay with the humans were filled with a quiet, determined routine. She found herself slowly adjusting to this new existence, this strange place where survival didn't depend on strength alone, but on cooperation and trust. Drake, though no longer the only one checking on her, remained a constant figure in her recovery. Every morning he was there, helping her with exercises, bringing her food, and speaking to her like a friend rather than an alien. It was different than anything she had known. But despite the growing sense of safety in their small camp, Syrah's heart remained restless. Even as her physical strength returned, her mind couldn't shake the fear of what lay ahead. Her people, the Zephyr, were relentless. They would not simply accept her disappearance. They would send hunters, trackers, and spies across the galaxy to find her. She knew them too well. She had once been a part of their royal court, and their sense of duty was absolute. A royal heir who failed to fulfill her role was more than a disappointment. They were an anomaly to be corrected, one way or another. On the 5th day since her recovery, the camp buzzed with an uneasy tension. News had spread quickly that an unknown vessel had entered Synfora's orbit, and whispers of possible Zephyr ships reached the crew's ears. Drake had heard it too, the crackling reports over the communication system, but he had refused to acknowledge the growing sense of panic in the air. If the Zephyr were here, they would be trouble. But if they were coming for Syrah, then Drake would fight for her, no matter the cost. "We have to prepare," Drake said one night, his voice low but urgent. They were seated together in the command tent, a small space cluttered with equipment, maps, and communication devices. "We can't ignore the possibility that the Zephyr might have come for you." Syrah looked up, her violet eyes troubled. "I told you, they won't stop until I'm either dead or back under their control. They will send hunters for me. Zephyr hunters are the deadliest of their kind." Drake nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He had known the Zephyr were formidable, but he had not fully understood their brutality. The idea of a race willing to go to such lengths to reclaim someone they deemed broken was chilling. But what choice did they have now? "We'll make sure you're safe," Drake said with a quiet resolve. "The crew's been working on a plan. We have some defensive capabilities, and I've been in contact with our command. Maybe we can get some reinforcements." Syrah's gaze softened. She had expected him to turn away, to treat her as nothing more than a burden. Instead, he was ready to fight for her, to risk everything. She didn't know what to make of it. The idea of trusting them fully still felt foreign, but in this moment, the human resolve seemed unwavering. "There's nothing you can do," she said, her voice tense. "If they've come, they've already tracked my energy signature. Even with reinforcements, they'll find us. The Zephyr are not like your people. They can track you through the slightest anomaly in a star system." Drake didn't flinch. "Then we'll run. We can leave Synfora. There's a system a few parsecs away that's isolated. It's not much, but it's a chance." Syrah's heart thudded at the idea. Running was not something she had considered. It was the ultimate sign of weakness, of defeat. But as she stared into Drake's determined face, a strange comfort settled over her. Maybe, just maybe, this time running could mean survival. For her, for them, for the future that had seemed so out of reach. The plan was quickly set into motion. The humans had a fleet of small but capable ships, nothing compared to the mighty Zephyr warships, but it would be enough to evade them for a time. Syrah found herself caught in the whirlwind of preparation, her mind still racing with possibilities and fears. As the crew gathered supplies, checked equipment, and discussed tactics, Syrah's thoughts drifted back to her home. What had become of her people? Were they even searching for her? Or had they already discarded her as irredeemable? Drake seemed to sense the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. As the sun began to set, casting the desert world in a golden hue, he found her alone on a small ridge overlooking the camp. She stood there, her arms crossed, her gaze lost in the vast emptiness of the desert. "Thinking about your people?" he asked, stepping up beside her. Syrah didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the horizon, her heart heavy with memories of a world she had once belonged to. The beauty of it, the grandeur, the history, it all seemed so far away now. She had once been a queen. Now she was an outcast, a fugitive. "I'm not sure where I belong anymore," she said finally, her voice distant. "I was cast aside by my own people for something beyond my control. Now, I'm a burden to yours." Drake's expression softened. "You're not a burden. And you don't belong to anyone but yourself. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that we get to decide our fate, no one else. And if you don't want to go back to your people, then you don't have to." Syrah's lips parted in surprise. There was something in his voice that made her feel as though she wasn't just an outsider anymore. Maybe for the first time, she truly felt like she had a choice. She looked at Drake, meeting his eyes, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to consider something impossible. Maybe, just maybe, she could leave her past behind. Maybe her future didn't have to be determined by the expectations of a world that had never truly understood her. "I don't want to go back," she said softly. "But I don't know what I'm supposed to do next." Drake smiled, his hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture of quiet solidarity. "Then we'll figure it out together." But even as the words left his lips, neither of them could ignore the faint, ominous rumble of a storm on the horizon. Not just the storm of the planet's endless sand dunes, but a storm of something far more dangerous, one that would soon change everything. Into the eye of the storm. The stars above Senfora had begun to burn brighter as the planet's two suns set, casting long, haunting shadows across the barren landscape. The camp was alive with quiet urgency. Crew members moved between tents, making final checks on equipment, securing supplies, and reviewing the escape routes. Every word spoken was laced with tension. The fear of the Zephyr arriving was not just a threat. It was an inevitability. Syrah could feel it in her bones, like a distant rumble in the ground, growing closer with every passing minute. Drake stood near the edge of the camp, his face grim, eyes scanning the horizon. It was a stark contrast to the ever-present warmth in his demeanor when he was near her, but Syrah understood. There was no time for comfort now. This was real. They had no choice but to prepare for the worst. "We leave at first light," Drake said to the crew, his voice low but decisive. "Everyone's ready, right?" A chorus of affirmations followed. The plan was simple: escape Senfora before the Zephyr hunters arrived. The humans had a small fleet of ships, fast and capable of outrunning most pursuers, but not without risk. If the Zephyr were already on their trail, the humans would be fighting against time, space, and a much more powerful enemy. But they would do it. Drake had made sure of it. Syrah, still recovering but more capable each day, found herself caught between fear and something else, something unfamiliar, a feeling of belonging, of purpose. These humans, who had nothing to gain by helping her, were risking everything to protect her. They didn't see her as an alien. They didn't see her as a failure. They saw her as a person, a living, breathing being worthy of compassion and care. And for the first time since her exile, that was enough. But fear still gnawed at her. Her people, the Zephyr, were ruthless in their pursuit of those who had failed. Her bloodline, her status as a royal heir, had been torn from her the moment she was deemed broken. It was a punishment they didn't give lightly. No one escaped their retribution. No one. "We're going to be okay, right?" Syrah asked quietly as she joined Drake by the edge of the camp. Her voice was a whisper, almost as if she feared the answer. Drake turned to her, his face softening despite the gravity of the situation. "We'll do everything we can. You won't be alone. I promise." But even as the words left his lips, a faint shimmer of light appeared on the horizon. The first signs of the approaching storm. The ship scanners had detected the Zephyr presence. The threat wasn't just a possibility. It was here. "They're coming sooner than we expected," Drake muttered, his eyes narrowing. "We need to move now." The camp went into overdrive. Drake barked orders to the crew, who began to scramble into action. Syrah felt a surge of panic deep within her chest, but she fought it down. There was no time for fear. There was only survival. "We have to go, Syrah," Drake said, his voice urging her forward. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip firm but gentle. "Stay close to me. We'll be all right." Syrah nodded, though the weight of the moment was pressing heavily on her. The human determination was infectious, but even their bravery couldn't protect them from what was coming. They were about to step into the unknown, fleeing from a race that was known across the galaxy for their merciless efficiency. "Drake," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "what happens if we can't outrun them? If they catch us?" Drake looked back at her, his expression hardening. "Then we fight. And we fight until the very last breath. But we're not going down without a fight. We're humans, and that's what we do." There was something in his words that struck Sura deeper than any royal decree had ever done. She had never heard such conviction, such unwavering certainty in the face of destruction. It was the kind of spirit that would never bow, that would always find a way. The group began to gather at the ships, their engines roaring to life, ready to leave the planet behind. The dust of Xanthora swirled in the air as the wind picked up, a reflection of the storm that had begun to rise both in the skies above and in the hearts of those preparing to flee. Drake and Sura boarded one of the smaller ships, their seats secured as the engines hummed with power. The crew quickly followed, but there was no time for goodbyes. The task was simple: escape the Zephyr, survive. But as the ship lifted off, heading toward the stars, Sura couldn't help but glance back at the planet she had once called home. It felt so distant now, like a life that no longer belonged to her. Her people had abandoned her, and now she was leaving them behind. The weight of that finality settled heavily in her chest. "We'll be all right," Drake said again, his voice calm. But there was an edge to it now. The reality of the situation was settling in. Sura wasn't sure if she believed him. But as they broke through the atmosphere, leaving the dusty wastelands of Xanthora far below, she found herself silently praying that somehow, against all odds, they would make it. And with the humans by her side, maybe, just maybe, she could start anew. But even as they soared into the vastness of space, Sura knew one thing for sure. The storm was not over. It was only just beginning.